Hello, BookTube, and welcome to June on the Range 2023, the return of a very beloved BookTube event in which myself and a bunch of co-hosts, under the direction of our trail boss, Michael K Vaughan, read Western novels throughout the month of June. Last year was a blast. A blast. I found a whole bunch of authors that I'd never encountered before. I heard a whole bunch of stories. So many people did June on the Range videos who were not June on the Range co-hosts. I heard so many stories from people, both in their own videos and via email, of their histories with Westerns and how far back they go and what treasured memories there are for lots of fathers or grandfathers who had whole Louis L'Amour collections or whatnot. Just wonderful. Absolutely fun. For a genre of fiction that once upon a time didn't need an event to boost its profile. Once upon a time, Westerns were everything. They were everything on TV, they were everything in the movie theaters, and they were everything in the bookstore. For most readers, they were always spurned by, the hoi polloi. For the highfalutin literary snobs have almost always spurned them. But most other people know, and nowadays, good luck finding a new release that's a Western, unless it's the self-published one. And I am ranging all over the place for June on the Range 2023. I have no plan, any more than I do for any of my other BookTube events. I have no plan. I'm just going to find authors and bear down on some of them. Now, one of the elements that I noticed last year about Western novelists is that they tend to have backlists that are hundreds of books long, which is kind of unbelievable. It actually is believable because publishers and magazines paid, and this is what they paid for. But that means that you could spend a lifetime reading through the life work of an author. I mean, we think about Louis L'Amour just reflexively as that, but he was by far from alone when it came to authors that wrote hundreds and hundreds of books. So who knows? Who knows? I don't know for June on the Range whether I will read a wide variety of authors or whether, who knows, in mid-month maybe I'll hit an author I really like and decide to read 20 books. But I'm reading an author today who very much fits that bill. The author is William MacLeod Raine, who was actually born in England, but then he moved to his parents moved to the United States when he was a little boy, and they moved west. They moved to the Texas-Arkansas border when at a time, a century ago, when it was decidedly unsettled. So he ate this stuff up in his bones. He got this stuff at least as much from third-hand personal experience as he did from books. Although, boy, he got a lot of it from books. I don't know anything about this author except the bare bones that I got in the book. But nevertheless, reading the book makes it very clear that he got a lot of what he's doing from books, from reading dime store Westerns himself. And I chose Bucky O'Connor, his Western Bucky O'Connor, which is... It starts off on a stagecoach, on a train that's being robbed. A train is accosted by the gang of Wolf Leroy, masked bandits who make everyone line up against the wall. They want all the valuables of all of the passengers, but they also want the train's financial payload. It's carrying the budget, the operating budget of a railway tycoon. And they want that too. They come with dynamite to blow the safe on board the train. And on board the train is a sheriff named Bear Trap Collins, who's genial and extremely likable. He flags the train down at the beginning of the novel. He uses a bandana to flag it down. And the operator is telling him for 2 pages, solid, that it's illegal to do that we're not allowed to make unlicensed stops, etc., etc., etc. Bear Trap Collins doesn't care. And when he sits down with all of the passengers, he's immediately everybody's best friend. But he's not the main character. The main character is Lieutenant Bucky O'Connor of the Arizona Rangers. And he only gets involved after the train robbery. We don't meet him for quite some time in this book. Raine does a good job of increasing our anticipation of meeting Bucky O'Connor because we don't meet him right away. We meet Bear Trap Collins, who in a less ambitious novel would be the main character. Instead, he is definitely a main character. And they want to hunt down these robbers, and they want to figure out what's going on and what their connection might be to some of the passengers on board the train. But a lot more goes on than that. The plot, this doesn't need to be as long as it is. It's not a long book, but it doesn't need to be as long as it is. Raine chucks in a lot to this wilderness stew, including an adventure that Bucky O'Connor eventually sidles into the main spotlight and has an adventure across the border in Mexico. This is down in the Nogales territory, right on the border of Mexico. Very, very inhospitable territory, as I know quite well, because I've tramped over every inch of it. When you are driving down that road, I forget the name of the major highway when you're going there into Tucson. But when you're driving down that highway just for an hour or 2 hours at a time, and you're looking out over the endless chaparral on either side in the baking 110-degree heat, I've walked that ground. I didn't drive past it. I walked it. So, and it's fairly well evoked in this book. But Bucky O'Connor has adventures across the border, including one incredibly far-fetched thing in which he is disguised as a Spanish pistolero. It's not convincing, but it is incredibly entertaining. Once you get used to a couple of things, I don't imagine many of you are going to rush out and buy Bucky O'Connor by William McLeod Rain, but you have to get used to a couple of things. One is something that Michael K Vaughan, our trail boss, has brought up a few times. A few other people have brought it up. I've been very, very happy. I don't know why it would surprise me. I have fallen in with the right group of people on BookTube. Definitely. Even so, I was a little bit surprised at how well everybody connected with BookTube has just taken the flaws of Westerns. And I don't mean the poor plotting or the poor characters or whatnot. I mean the sexism and especially the bigotry, the racism. It's practically in the groundwater in a lot of these books. I would argue that, oddly, Louis L'Amour himself is almost innocent of it. He almost doesn't. You almost don't find it in a lot of the books. I haven't read all of his books, obviously, but I've read a lot of his books, and you almost don't find it. But if you're going to read widely for June on the Range, if you're going to read Western novels, you are going to encounter it. And I have been so pleased by how many booktubers have just rolled with it. Just roll with it. You're not being accused. You might be accusing the author, but the author's long dead. See if there's a story here. See if there's a reason to put up with that. There almost always is. It just depends. I would argue that the reason there almost always is a story to get to by putting up with those kinds of obnoxious elements is because because the writers of these stories weren't bigots. They were just writing in their own time. That's why I would argue that it's not all that much of an obstacle. I think if you were to read a Western novel from 70 years ago, written by a bigot, an actual bigot, I think you'd notice. I think it would be a lot different from the reading experience that you get in a lot of these books. That having been said, there are elements of that all throughout this book. The women are considered children, or sirens, or temptresses. And when Bucky O'Connor is in Mexico, he is captured, he is put on trial in a kangaroo court, he is expected that he will die, unless he rats out his friends, and he is constantly saying, I mean, it happens dozens of times, he is constantly saying that that's not the behavior of a white man. He's constantly putting it that way. That you can't expect a white man to behave that way. I couldn't help but, give a little rueful smile when I was reading those, because it's talk like that got Tucker Carlson fired just in 2023. I don't know, actually, from reading this book, now that I think about it, I don't really know if William McLean Rain was actively racist towards, the native peoples that he met, First Nations people, the Mexicans that he met, that he knew in, Texas. I don't really know from reading this book. I think it could go either way, but he's a heck of a storyteller. I was willing to overlook it. I'm not sure if it got much worse than it is in this book. I probably wouldn't, but it isn't that bad in this book. And the book has so many storytelling, just effusive storytelling gimmicks to recommend it once you look past that I was mostly entertained. Like, for instance, when those robbers attack the train at the beginning of the book, and the snooty lady, the requisite snooty femme on the train is a little bit dismissive that Bear Trap Collins didn't fight these bandits, that he didn't put up a fight. He tells her, well, I didn't want stray hot lead to be flying all over the place. It was all of them against me. She's awful dismissive of him, and he starts to think that maybe there's more to her than meets the eye. Of course, he's right. His instincts are right. He would make a fascinating character. Maybe William McLeod Rain did write a book about him. I don't know. But the kind of narrative gimmicks that I'm talking about, for instance, at one point, he hands her a note. He writes a little note and hands it to her and says, don't open it right now. Open it in a month. And you're reading along. She doesn't open it, and we're not told what it says. And I was reading along for the first time, and I was thinking, okay, I can guess. I'm going to make a guess what that note says. Just on the basis of the Sir Walter Scott, Charles Dickens antics, of narrative antics that are going on here, I'm going to guess what that note says, and I was right. I was absolutely right. But Bucky O'Connor is less interesting than Bear Trap Collins. And he's a lot less interesting than Wolf Leroy, the leader of the gang, the notorious leader of the gang. It's interesting to me that the hero of the book, Bucky O'Connor, and Wolf Leroy are both described as slight men. They are not big and burly like Bear Trap Collins. They're slight men and soft-spoken. I thought it was very interesting. I don't know what's going on there, except maybe that William McLeod Rain was also slight and soft-spoken. That would be my guess. But there's a rousing conclusion, and there's also really, really florid language. I want to read you an example of what I'm talking about here, because if you didn't know that William McLeod Rain was raised on Trollope, you would probably be able to tell from his diction. At one point, we're told, at the sound of Collins' voice, the masked man had started perceptibly, and his right hand had jumped forward an inch or two to cover the speaker more definitely. Thereafter, no matter what else engaged his attention, the gleaming eyes behind the red bandana never wandered for a moment from the big plainsman. He was taking no risks, for he remembered the saying current in Arizona that after Collins's hardware got into action, there was nothing left to do but plant the deceased and collect the insurance. He had personal reasons to know the fundamental accuracy of the colloquialism. You're not going to get much of that in Louis L'Amour, and that is all through this book. This is the most orotund, the most rhetorically ornate Western that I've ever read. So I will go back to this author. We will see. I'm curious to know if he strikes that tone in every book. I have a novel of his called OU Text that I could go back to. I'm also curious to know, I admit, about the less savory aspects that I mentioned. The sexism, I don't think there's anything you can do about. I think Westerns are mainly written by sexists. So I think it's just, until you get much later, I really just think it's part of the appeal. I think no Western author, even if that Western author isn't a sexist, would write a non-sexist book. It's the other stuff. It's the bigotry. It's the offhand contempt for First Nations people. I don't know whether to call them American Indians or Native Americans, or First Nation or whatever. Like I've said before, First Nation is such a cool phrase that I want to use it anyway. So I'm not trying to be politically correct. I just think that's so cool. It'd be like if you were referring to Irish people as Emerald Scions, but you couldn't, because we've always been trash, and we still are. But it'd be nice if you were to do that. If you were to say, from now on we're going to call Irish Americans Emerald Scions, I would be all over that. But First Nations is just so cool, and I can't help but use it. And in this book, First Nations people, but especially Mexicans, are treated with what looks like racist contempt. So I'd be curious to know in another William McLeod Rain novel whether or not I'm going to encounter both of those things. So I will certainly be reading this author again. I don't know that I'll read him right away. Much like with Book Trek, I don't know what I'm going to read next for June on the Range. I'm going to read something tonight. But I don't know if it'll be another one of this author. I've got a lot of authors to get to. I'm more than I can do in a month, more than I can do in a year of months. But that is my first foray into June on the Range. Bucky O'Connor, which I largely liked. But it does raise questions that we're all going to have to deal with for June on the Range. I think it's fascinating that I have such a large group of active, passionate readers who aren't going to get all pearl clutchy about this. Instead, we can just talk about it, which is great. It is absolutely great to be able to talk about the subject of, for instance, the sexism or especially bigoted racism that is baked into Westerns with a group of people who aren't going to say, well, if you don't drop the book completely, you yourself are a racist. It is great to talk to normal people about this. We can just talk it out. Like, for instance, when it comes to Bucky O'Connor, I want to know, would that ruin the reading experience for you? Or would it be a case, as I think it is maybe with me, I don't know. I'll find out in the course of this month. With me, it's maybe the case that it's not the appearance of that sort of thing. It's the frequency. I would think if it occurs just regularly, just like a metronome, then it means that the author is letting loose some demons on the page that I don't want to see. I don't want to know about. I wouldn't want to know the author if those are his preoccupations. If it's not that, if it's background noise, then I think I can probably put up with some of it, especially if the author is talented. But I wonder if that's true with you. Lord knows you don't. It doesn't have to be. There are plenty of, believe it or not, I'm pretty sure there are plenty of Westerns out there where this doesn't come up. And I know for a fact that in the 50s and up to the mid-60s, Louis L'Amour and a lot of his compatriots in the Western writing field were conscious of this fact and intentionally pulling away from it, intentionally treating all their characters with respect and making sure that their bad guys are also bigots and that their bigots are also bad guys. I'd love to hear about it with you. I think this is fascinating. I don't mean to turn June on the Range. June on the Range is purely fun. It is purely for fun. I don't mean to turn it into, a classroom seminar, but these are the sorts of things that I'm just boring enough to think about. I'd love to hear about it from you. But I'm going to go on to another Western next time. No idea what it will be. We will reconvene a little ways further on down the trail. Thank you.